Because it's 9 o'clock, let's start. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's webinar in cooperation with Asian Vision Institute and other organizations. As shown in the slides, let me raise a few things before we start our webinar. First of all, this webinar is recorded and
recording in progress.
It will be available for viewing later on. So if you are here, then you agree to being included in the recording. Also, slides are in Dropbox, Google Drive, which we can download directly. You have seen the link, but I will put it again in the chat box. Secondly, there's a poll. Please fill out the poll. It will be very helpful for us to understand who attends our events. And finally, we apologize that you cannot see each other. This is a security feature of the Zoom app platform that we use. But I see here now that we have more than about 40 people attending, and you cannot see each other's name, but I would like to remind everyone, perhaps you already seen this information online, that we will open the Zoom room for about 15 to 20 minutes after the seminar to allow everyone to catch up, to chat informally. So feel free to join us at the end of the seminar. So that is it from me. So before we start, let me introduce our chair for this morning, which is Dr. Kim Long Cheng. Dr. Cheng is the Vice President of Asian Vision Institute. So Dr. Cheng, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much, Lady. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the support from the Australia Asia Council and the Australian National University, particularly Professor Budi Reso Sudarmo, for initiating on and also mobilizing the synergy among think tanks, academia, to run and share and exchanges the intellectual knowledge. I have also to acknowledge the support from Lydia and particularly the Forum Kaltian Pembangunan and the Australia, the ANU's Indonesian project, the Poverty and Inequality Research Center that Professor Budi Resu Sadamo is the Deputy Director. Next, I would like to show you how we are going to run this 90-minute webinar. Today's webinar is the third in the series since we have launched the webinar in a joint program. Today's webinar will be about the tension between employment and schooling in emerging Southeast Asian economies. And today we have the honor to have Professor Ian Coxhead from the University of Wisconsin, Madison, USA, to share his views and also the research findings from his intellectual research on, particularly with a focus on employment and schooling in Southeast Asia and how things have changed over the past years, decades, and what progress has been made, what challenges in the employment and schooling. And I think for the detail, I will give the floor to Professor Ian Coxhead. But before that, I would like to introduce Professor Ian Coxhead. Professor Ian Coxhead holds a professorship at the Wisconsin University and focusing on development economics in particularly. He has a wide range of experiences and also publication. In addition to that, Professor Ian Coxhead hold a honorary professorship at the Anne Corden Department of Economics at the Australian National University, and also a member in Inequality Measurement, Interpretation, and Policy Network in the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Global Working Group at the University of Chicago. And I would like to turn over the floor to Professor Ian Coxhead. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kim Long. Very kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be here, very honored to be here, and I thank you all for turning up for this talk as well. Let me begin attempting to share my screen. So if I do this right, everything will work just fine, right? Thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to present a non-technical discussion today, and this integrates research from the economics literature, as well as recent work by myself, some of my colleagues, some of whom are online here, and also some of my past and current doctoral advisees, University of Wisconsin. I want to tell you a little bit about the origins of my interest in this topic. Like many of you, I was trained at the Australian National University, and there I was trained in trade and development, and I'm old enough that it was in when there wasn't. Okay, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about my interest in this topic. It is because as the region has evolved, as data have become more abundant, the connections between trade and economic well-being have become clearer to us and more easily capable of analysis. And in particular, the labor market, which is really the key channel for transmission of shocks from the global economy or trade policy through to individuals and households, has really come into focus. And so over the years, I found my work drawn increasingly towards study of the labor market, specifically as this channel for transmission of shocks. So that's the origin of my interest in this area in general. What I want to talk about today is a subset of that interest. It focuses on education, and in particular on the educational decisions made by adolescents, those reaching working age and soon after those years. So basically 15 to 20 or 15 to 18 years old. And the reason for that is that these are children at a point in life where they're making a decision between schooling and joining the labor force. And I want to explore some of the details and the ramifications of that decision. So let me begin with a little survey of data. If we look at international comparisons of education attainment, these are the entire labor force of countries, then we can see that educational attainment in the labor force from 1990 to the most recent year available, 2017, has risen very fast in lots of countries. But we can also see, looking at the right-hand side of the diagram, that there are several countries in which the last decade or so have been a kind of a letting off in terms of educational attainment. The countries in this group include Thailand, China, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And this leveling off is taking place at an average years of schooling around about 8 in the population. So they're well below the rate for, let's say, East Asian countries. Indeed, well below the 1990 rates of education population for those countries. Those countries have continued to increase education since. So good progress in education over the labor force as a whole, but some sign that the rate of increase is slowing down, and that's not because everybody is staying in school all the way through to the end of 12th grade or beyond. Here's the same data, but in the horizontal axis of the diagram is the log of per capita income in constant 2011 international dollars. And these are kind of squiggly looking lines, but they contain quite a lot of information. Okay, so what you can see here is that countries reach that 8 years of schooling level at very different levels of per capita income. For Singapore, for countries like Indonesia, much, much lower. So there's no single story about when a country reaches that level. If we look at the vertical line, that's comparing levels of education at the same level of per capita income. And what I'm comparing there is Korea in 1990, that's the top circle you can see, with Indonesia and then Thailand. And you can see that at the same level of income, the three countries had quite different average years of schooling, basically 9, 8, and 7 in that order. Kim Long and Lydia, I'll ask you to tell me if you can't hear me at any time, because I can't hear you.
Yeah,
I wasn't speaking, but is this the correct slide?
That's right, yeah. Please go to the next slide.
All right. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, that's the one. So then I mentioned that more recent gains in education are kind of modest. Now, you're going to see in this talk that I draw on data from a number of different countries and times. It looks like what the Australians will call a dog's breakfast, but what I'm trying to establish really is that there's a pretty strong common story across several of the lower income countries in the region. Left-hand side of this diagram shows us recent progress since 2007. That increase has been relatively slow. In fact, much less than a one-year gain over the last 7 years of the data. The right-hand side shows us school enrollment by cohort in Thailand, by age of student, as you can see in the horizontal axis. And what we see there is that there's really a very strong clustering for each of the years of data shown. That is, there hasn't been a whole lot of progress in Thailand in terms of the net enrollment rate of high school age children from 15 and beyond in Thailand. So kind of modest progress, even in spite of very rapid income growth. So both Indonesia and Thailand, as you know, of course, had very rapid income growth over this one generation long period. Next slide, please, Lydia. This is a different view of the same data. These look like, go back one, please. These look like population pyramids. If you would go back to the previous slide.
Yes, I have.
Yeah, thank you.
It takes a few seconds to adjust.
This is correct. Yeah, I'm sorry. There must be a delay, I think. So,
yeah.
The left-hand side of these two pyramids shows us the top quintile of households by income. The right-hand side, the poorest quintile in Vietnam, and then the left-hand side of each pyramid is 2006. The right-hand side is 2016. So this is a decade that straddles very, very rapid economic growth in Vietnam. And what I want to point out is just that on the left-hand side, wealthy households already sent almost, their children had almost full enrollment in school up to age 15, which is the dotted horizontal line. And then in 2016, they consolidated that with a lot of progression, a lot more progression to upper secondary school and to tertiary education as well. So the pyramid gets wider and wider. The right-hand side shows what happens in Vietnam's poorer households, where, of course, overall enrollment is much lower, so the pyramid is narrower, and then it tapers much faster at an early age. By 2016, we can see that the poorest households have almost full enrollment in primary school, the grey part, and lower secondary school, the orange part. But then, as before, there's a very rapid drop-off in enrollments after age 15, and much fewer children going to high school and almost none still tertiary. Next slide, please. So a very quick overview of the talk, if the internet connection will permit it. This is what I'll do. A little bit about trade, and then a closer attention to the demand for skills and return schooling and their influences on schooling. So very briefly, this is what passes for a theory section in the talk, I guess. We have very familiar concepts about the results of trade. Trade leads to specialization and efficiency gains, and increases total income. We know that trade in turn attracts FDI, and that in turn further increases income and potential for specialization. We know that patterns of specialization follow comparative advantage, and that depends on abundant resources, including labor. And I want to make a note here that there are also important second-round effects. That is, the sectors which grow fastest with trade are, of course, those directly linked to trade, or FDI. But then we also have second-round effects, which is growth in jobs that service those tradable industries, for example, in construction and services. And it turns out that the numbers for those jobs are very, very big. The Lao data, for example, suggests that for every one job created in the garment industry, there are about 2 or 3 jobs created in construction and another 2 or 3 in various kinds of services. So there's a big kind of job multiplier effect. And the key point about those other industries is that while the tradable industries themselves may be classed as relatively skill intensive by poor country standards, the industries around them, that is construction and services, are much less skill intensive. Next slide, please. Okay. So how does it all work? Well, very quickly again, if we think about an economy in which trade is being liberalized, we know that reducing tariffs on final goods typically reduces protection for very capital-intensive industries. Capital intensity and skill intensity go together, so that lowering final goods tariffs or other barriers, of course, may reduce relative skill demand. And then if we lower barriers on imports of intermediate goods, those used by the assembly industry, then we know that those tariffs will increase profits and encourage investments in low-skill assembly-type operations. But these are dominated, of course, by blue-collar employment. So putting these two things together, while trade may certainly raises incomes, it may also compress the skill premium, that is, the ratio of skilled wages to unskilled wages in the economy. And this is the source of the tension referred to in the title of my talk, that income growth has got to be good for education, but reducing the skill premium, that is, reducing the implicit return to educational investments, is not going to be good for education. So which effect is going to dominate? Next slide, please. Okay. Since we are running short on time already, let me skip this slide, please, to the next one. Okay. So in general, when we look at empirical studies of low-income countries, we see these kinds of Stolper-Samuelson effects. That is, that as they become more engaged with the global economy, the skill premium becomes compressed. That is, low-skill wages rise faster than high-skill wages. But what about educational responses? That's just the skill premium. There are surprisingly few studies that trace the effects of trade all the way through to educational decisions by children. A very recent study by Blanchard and Olney looks at a giant cross-country panel of data and concludes quite conclusively that the expansion of agriculture and low-skill manufacturing is negatively associated with educational attainment, that the association of education with high-skilled manufacturing is, of course, positive, and that the numbers are pretty big. So in their average case for a low or lower middle-income country, they estimate that a 10% increase in low-skilled manufacturing exports causes almost 2 months less schooling over the entire labor force, which is a pretty big number. Next slide, please. Turning now to a specific country, we've seen studies in Indonesia that also demonstrate that lower tariffs on imported inputs, those things that favor the assembly industry, garments, footwear, simple electronics and electrical appliances, these lower tariffs on intermediates also reduce the skill premium within the affected firms. So the Amity Cameron study cited here is one that uses firm level data. But we know that the overall effect, which includes all of these other jobs outside of industrial zones and outside of factories, in construction and services and so on, is likely to be a much bigger effect because of the relatively lower skill intensity of those industries. And this maybe helps us to begin to understand a puzzle in the literature in Indonesia, which is that during the more recent resource boom in the 2000s, we observed declining returns to years of schooling. And one possible causal pathway that would help us to understand that goes from the boom in resource exports to increased demand for services and, of course, reduction in profitability of many of the more skill-intensive traded industries, so that there's a lot of low-skill and especially informal jobs getting created. And what we know about the informal sector, especially in services, is that these jobs offer pretty low returns to cognitive skills, the kinds of things that you would get from going to school. And they also discouraged employer investments in training. And so in general are going to be discouraging of both schooling and post-school education. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know of the region as a whole. We know that sectors that produce particularly tradable goods vary in the intensity of blue-collar and skilled labor inputs. We know that changes in trade status, for example, through free trade agreements or domestic policy liberalization, alter relative industry growth rates. And this in turn leads to changes in the relative demand for skills versus blue-collar workers, and thus should exert an influence on expected returns to investments in skills, that is, in the demand for schooling. And this should be especially obvious for children who are around the age where they can decide whether to stay in school or join the labor force. So one way to think about the skill premium is that that's a pretty good indicator, or it should be a pretty good indicator, of the expected return on schooling investments. And for any other analysis of an investment decision, of course, the expected return on that investment would be a right-hand side variable, that is an explanatory variable. That's the way we're going to treat it in the following analysis as well. Okay, next slide, please. And that one, yeah. No, next one, and probably one more. There, that'll do. So this growth of export industries in Southeast Asia has been, of course, very rapid, as we all know. The left-hand side diagram shows us the increase in the ratio of exports to GDP in 4 countries, including Cambodia. The right-hand diagram shows us the ratio of skilled to unskilled labor in the value added of those exports, of exports from those countries, as well as a couple of other countries. So the very top green line is Singapore. And then the other countries that we're interested in are clustered down the bottom. And you can see that over the period from 1995 to the most recent available data, 2011, there's pretty much no change, and even possibly some decline in the skill intensity of production in exports from lower income Southeast Asian countries. So not a lot of evidence of upskilling taking place in those industries. Next slide, please. Let me skip this slide to save time. And this one as well. Let's talk about influences on schooling decisions. For this part of my talk, I'm going to focus on work that I've been doing with, as I said, with several collaborators in Vietnam. I'm going to focus on Vietnam because we have good data and because the Vietnamese experience has been a particularly interesting one. Very rapid globalization and very rapid transformation of the economy, reorienting it towards trade, and accompanying that a very substantial movement of labor from traditional sectors like agriculture into the trade-oriented or export-oriented labor force. During this transformation, average years of schooling have risen pretty substantially. However, once again, we see evidence of a slowdown, especially in recent years, coincidentally, since about the year 2007, in which Vietnam joined the WTO. So since 2008, there's been pretty much no increase in the net enrollment rate for upper secondary school. It's hovered at around 74% of children. In that same period, since the WTO accession, the share of the labor force that holds a university degree has doubled, but it's only doubled from 4 to 8%. And the share with secondary or lower forms of vocational education has remained pretty stable at about 20%. And more interestingly still, all estimates of the returns to a year of additional schooling in Vietnam peaked in 2008 to 2010 and have declined since, as we'll see in the next slide. If you would go to the next slide, please, Lydia. Here's one set of estimates of these. The years are across the bottom. There are two kinds of econometric estimator being used, but you can see that they follow the same path. And if you look at 2008, you can see that's the peak year for estimated returns to schooling in Vietnam. That's the year in which they're hitting around about 10% per year, which is kind of the international norm for these things. And then surprisingly, perhaps, they fall by around about 40% over the subsequent 6 years. This is one set of estimates. There are several other estimates out there in the literature. They're listed at the bottom of this slide, and they all show broadly consistent stories of a peak in returns to schooling around about 2008, 2010, and a decline in subsequent years. Next slide, please. This shows us a breakdown of the skill composition of employment in Vietnam by the ownership of the sector. So the labor force survey allows us to compile these data. And what we see here is that for the domestic private sector, which accounts in 2014 for about 80% of workers, almost all of the workers in that sector, 77% in fact, have incomplete secondary or less, that is, up to about 9th grade education or lower. The only sector in which tertiary education and completed high school education plays a very significant role is the government and state-owned enterprise sector, which employs about 16% of the labor force. And then the FDI sector, which employs in that year about 4%, is kind of a mix of the two. But the takeaway from this is that for a typical student reaching about age 15 in Vietnam, and maybe not the brightest student in their class or not coming from an elite household, they're going to look at the labor market and they're going to pretty quickly conclude that the majority of job opportunities open to them are relatively low-skilled opportunities. And if they invest in additional skills, then their possibilities for additional employment with those skills become quite narrow, especially if they don't have good connections to get them into government or state-owned enterprise jobs, because those jobs are rationed, and that rationing mechanism depends on other members of the family already working in those sectors. So for the typical kid, hitting about age 15, they look at the labor market out there and they see that most of the jobs are for relatively low-skilled students, in fact, students with education up to about 15 or less years old. Next slide, please. Rashesh Shrestha and I looked at district-level data in Vietnam, and we found that when we used the share of FDI employment in a district as a proxy for labor market activity, we found that the greater the share of that employment, the higher the propensity for children to be out of school at ages 15 through 18. That's what these negative numbers here show. I won't dwell on that. Let's move ahead. Next slide, please. So I do want to spend a few minutes here. We have a nice opportunity in Vietnam to look at some of the factors that contribute to schooling decisions. And this comes about because children in grade 9 who want to go to grade 10, that is upper secondary school, have to take and pass an exam. And that exam is not standard across the country, but the need to take it is standard. And it's a pretty scary exam, I think, for a lot of 9th graders. As it turns out, around about 80% of children nationwide choose to take this exam. Not all of them pass. But what we're really interested in is the kind of last mile provinces or children at the extensive margin of the educational system, not in the capital city, not in Ho Chi Minh City, not from elite families, but from kind of regular families where the overall test taking rate is much lower. And we want to try to understand, if we can, the extent to which they are influenced in their decision to take this test, that is, to try to go on to grade 10 at all, by labour market considerations. Next slide, please. So here, very quickly, the four provinces we're looking at all have income per capita below the national average, from 88% down to 55 or 56%. Next slide, please. And these are the four provinces, and the numbers in bold in the second column show us the mean test-taking rate. So from Lowskilled, with only 36% of children attempting the exam, up to Thanh Hoa province with 78% attempting the exam. So this says in Lowskilled that 2/3 of children who are of the age to try to enter grade 10 aren't even trying. That is, they've finished their schooling and they're going on to do other things. So we want to understand what might help to, what might influence that decision. In the next slide, we'll see some of that. Okay, let's skip that one and go to the next one, just to save time. All right, so I'm going to show you one table of regression results tonight. This is it. Every econ talk has to have at least some numbers in it, after all. And this is a regression for which the dependent variable in each column is the proportion of children in a district in our sample provinces who are taking the test. That is, the ratio of test takers to the total population of 15-year-olds in the district. And we just saw those numbers ranging from about 36% to about 78% in our sample provinces. And if you look in the middle of the table, you can see that when we include controls for average district average per capita expenditures, or the poverty headcount, or the ethnic minority population share, these are very significant predictors of propensity to take the test, with the first being positive and the other two being negative. But even after controlling for that, and after including controls for province and year, fixed effects, and the provincial capital, we still have in the top row that the concentration of FDI employment in the district has a significant and negative influence on the propensity for children to take the test. That is, that the ratio of test takers to total number of 15-year-olds in the district is lower by about 0.04 in each case. And to put that in perspective, the average FDI employment share in this sample is only about 0.4% of the labour force. These are mostly rural provinces. So if we increase that by one standard deviation, we're going to reduce propensity for schooling by about 4 percentage points. So, or rather, propensity to take the test by about 4 percentage points. So in a province with 60% of children attempting the exam, this will be 4 percentage points lower. So this is, I think, pretty strong evidence that the demand side of the skilled labour market plays a significant role in the decisions made by children to continue with school or not once they reach working age. Next slide, please. This just summarizes those numbers. And what I've done here is graphically shown the balance, if you like, between the influence of concentration of FDI jobs on the left side in blue, and the influence of these socioeconomic status indicators on the right side in orange. And we can see that as FDI jobs increase, that is, as the labour market in general becomes more active, then the propensity for that labour market to draw kids out of upper secondary school entry is roughly equal to that of 1% or a 10% increase in per capita income, or a 10% decrease in household poverty, or a 10% lower ethnic minority population share. So these are big numbers relative to the kinds of variables which are targeted by development policy, such as poverty or per capita income. Next slide, please, Lydia. So let me now turn to longer run effects. If you go to the next slide. I use this word tensions in the title of my talk because I feel that when we look at the rapid growth of tradable industries with relatively low skill ratios, and also the industries around them, that is construction and services, which come along with tradable industries, then we do see, I think, quite clearly a tension between the growth of demand for relatively low skilled labor and the other effects in the economy or other phenomena in the economy which are working to push education rates up. So, to summarize, in lower income economies in Southeast Asia, trade and other things like FDI raises incomes, but also likely reduces the skill premium. And that means that this compression effect offsets at least part of the positive income effect. And that in turn almost certainly affects decisions by children who are of age to be at the school to work margin. And what does this mean for longer term development? Well, first, it means that supply side efforts, that is, improvements in schooling, teacher training, curriculum reform, subsidies for schooling, all of these things, any effort to hit educational development targets is going to become more costly because it has to overcome the skill premium compression effect from booming tradable sectors. Secondly, the national government's aspirations to become a knowledge economy or some similar term, this is pretty much standard right across the region, may also recede because, as we saw right at the beginning of the talk, the fraction of children continuing in school and especially going on to upper secondary school, from which they may also go to college, has begun to grow much more slowly in recent years than it had in the very early years of modern economic development. So these, I think, pose real serious policy problems, and I want to come to those in just a moment. Next slide, please. Okay, well, you've all seen the smile curve before, I guess. The smile curve tells us about the distribution of value added in manufacturing. If you focus on the black line, the biggest smile, I guess, it tells us that the manufacturing stages of production, the lower part of the smile, have relatively low value added. The left-hand side, the product design and concept part, has high value added. And the right-hand side, after sales, marketing, and so on, also has high value added. The lower income economies of Southeast Asia have specialized in the middle part of the smile curve, the low value added activities. But I guess what I want to say is that there is no presumption that just by specializing there and getting more income, they will automatically progress to the sides of the smile or to higher value added activities. And I think looking at historical transitions like South Korea or Japan isn't really helpful, because the transitions of those countries took place at a totally different time in world history, under very different conditions of world trade and investment, and rules, of course, about tariffs and other instruments that could be deployed. So the countries of Southeast Asia, fully committed to participation in the global value chain, don't have a clear path charted for them by the experience of countries that have come before. Next slide, please. And I'm a little bit of a pessimist at heart, so I use the word low-skilled trap for this slide. Maybe that's melodramatic, I don't know. But I think that, one of the threats that we face here is that by exploiting comparative advantage in relatively low-skill activities, there could be a persistence. That is, that the success of those industries discourages investments in education and therefore maintains for a longer period of time comparative advantage in low-skill industries. So this is an idea that's been explored in a recent World Development article by McGuinness and others. And in practical terms, this comes about because young people have to choose between staying in school in the hope that additional education will be rewarded in the future, or jumping out and joining the lower skilled labor force at a relatively early age. And as I said, at a country level, there aren't really any good precedents for what will happen next. And that's also true for children today in Southeast Asia, because the cohorts that came before them had kind of different experiences. Even their immediate preceding cohorts show perhaps nothing more than that returns to additional schooling below university level, at least, can't be expected to earn a very high return. Next slide, please. So, what's going to break this this impasse, or what's going to get us out of the potential for a low-skilled trap? One possibility is that as household income grows, parents will invest more in their children. Higher incomes, fewer children per household should facilitate parental investments in the quality of their children, and that, of course, means health and also education. But there's really no guarantee that in a dynamically growing blue-collar labour market, this is going to substantively increase the skills endowment. Or if it does, it's probably going to take quite a long time. And the reason I say it might take a long time is because intergenerational transmission of educational achievements is very strongly persistent, as we'll see in the next slide. Right, my alarm went off for 40 minutes, so I'm going to start wrapping up pretty soon. Let's just look at the left-hand side of this slide. Here we see in-school rates or net enrollment rates for children in Vietnam by age from 15 to 18, so high school, upper secondary school age children, and also by the parental education. So the bottom blue line is children whose parents completed less than primary education. The top light blue line is children whose parents have completed tertiary education. And the bulk of the population lies somewhere between the orange line, which is parents who have completed primary, and the kind of violet-colored line, which is parents completing lower secondary education. And what we see there is that relative to the children from the more elite families, there's really a rapid drop-off in school persistence from 15 to 18 years old. The difference in enrollment rates at 15 is not that great for most families, at least, other than the poorest or the least educated parents. But that difference widens from about 20% between the highest and the tertiary educated parents and the primary school educated parents, out to more than 40% by age 18. So parental education has a strong and persistent effect on children's educational decisions. And I take away from that if parental income rises, then it's going to be a generational change, not the matter of a few years, before that translates into sustained investments in higher education for the children of those parents. So I don't think this is this is not a fix, or at least not a short-term fix, for the issue of undereducation in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. Another possibility is that there'll be a kind of an automatic mechanism that will increase productivity growth through trade, and that in turn will cause skill upgrading in exporting industries. And there's a lot of published evidence from other countries that supports this idea. However, most of that evidence uses data from an earlier era, essentially a pre-global value chain era, in which the nature of industry and the nature of tradable industry in particular was, I would argue, quite different. It's less obvious that the idea of learning by exporting and associated productivity growth and upskilling applies to global value chain industries like assembly, in which production methods and technology are pretty standardized. So in other words, there isn't any automatic, or there's no strong evidence of automatic progression from low skill to higher skill industries in the modern global value chain linked economies of the lower income world. Next slide, please. And the next. Okay, so the last part of my talk, I'm not a policy expert by any means. I would never claim to be, and I'm pretty sure that there are lots of people listening, if you're still there, who have much better idea and knowledge about policy, especially for education, than I do. But I want to throw out a couple of ideas. I've contrasted supply side and demand side in the market for skills. I've focused on the demand side, and I've said that the boom in tradable industries and relatively low skill occupations in Southeast Asia has had an influence on relative skill demands from the demand side. Of course, when it comes to policy, attention to supply-side measures has got to be and should remain paramount. Reforming curriculums, getting schools closer to children, making school more affordable, improving the quality of teachers, all of these things are really important and should continue. However, the impacts of all of these programs and reforms will always fall short of their goals, so long as they're kind of pushing back against the opposite signal from the demand side of the skills market. And that's my main point today, that in order to be really effective, there has to be attention both to the supply side of the education market, to increasing skills through education, and also to the demand side, that is making sure that firms seek to upskill and in doing so increase the relative reward to a year of education. Next slide, please, Lydia. Okay, this is my last slide. And this is where I try to pull it all together, I guess. I've focused on this tension between labour markets and educational goals. It's my view, very strongly held, that the issue of human capital accumulation with long-term ramifications both for households and for the aggregate economy is way too big of an issue to be left to only education policymakers, that is the Ministry of Education. It's certainly too big to be left to parents, and I've made that case. And it's absolutely, of course, inappropriate to expect adolescents themselves to make the right kinds of decisions to upskill. You know, the adolescent brain, as we know, is not especially well formed. It's not especially well disciplined. Present bias is a very big issue for adolescents. All of these things mean that we have to give them lots of encouragement and really change their belief systems in order to motivate them to stay in school. So what do we think about on the demand side of the skills market? We need complementary investments that will match the supply side investments, such as RISE and other educational development programs, which are great programs, by the way, but they operate only or almost exclusively on the supply side of the skills market. So here are my closing three thoughts. First of all, the Ministry for Industry, or its equivalent in whichever country you're thinking about, needs to work with employers to reduce mismatch with skills produced by the school system, and also to upgrade skills within the industry sector. And one of the ways in which they can do that, perhaps with the help of the Ministry of Finance or even the central bank, is to subsidize skills demand. And one of the ways to do that is to make capital much more readily available to small and medium industries, which are, after all, the largest employers and also the least skill-intensive employers in every economy of low and middle income Southeast Asia. And then finally, I think it's also maybe a little less concrete, but it's also really important to think at a very broad societal level about how to encourage belief on the part of children and their parents in a more skill-intensive economic future. I don't know exactly how to do that, but I think that's a very important complementary activity. The next slide, I hope, is the last slide. It is, so thank you very much for listening. I do apologize for the technical hitches that held us up along the way. And let me now turn it back to you, Kim Long.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think we are listening to your insightful presentation, and thank you for sharing your own research as well as recent publications from other sources. I think your topic is much more relevant to many Southeast Asian countries as well as other countries in the world, as they cover just more than education. I mean, it affects social decision, household decision, and also policy making with regard to whether, individual person or a country should move forward to skill upgrading or investment in further education and promoting the labor productivity while reducing the tension, as you mentioned. I think before further ado, let me go to a number of questions. I think we have a number of people now posing their questions. First of all, let me try to read the question from the audience. The first of the question to you, Professor, is this. I would like to hear from you about policy addressing the demographic situation in Indonesia, specifically huge productive age population, yet its quality is substandard in comparison to most neighboring countries. I am wondering whether we need to create as many jobs as possible, albeit mostly are low added value jobs rather than middle class jobs, in order to absorb the working age cohort in labor market. Or are there any other options? This question is posed by Darendra Wadana, I think from Indonesia.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Do you want to give me several questions, or shall I answer them one at a time?
I think if you would like to respond now, and the next, I think after your response, I will invite the audience to ask question directly, if they would like. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are probably lots of people in this presentation, in this session, who have better knowledge of Indonesian demography than I do, but let me try. One thing we know is that in spite of having a relatively young population, Indonesia, like most of the rest of Southeast Asia, is experiencing very rapid slowdown in population growth, and accompanying that, of course, aging of the population as well. And that demographic sea change, which is, of course, much more far advanced in countries like Thailand than it is in Indonesia, is going to be one of the key determinants of labor market trends over the next one generation or thereabouts. So to the question, I think it's important to create jobs, and I think that those jobs should, as much as possible, be middle-class jobs, but that the changing demographic structure is going to impose new kinds of pressures on attempts to create those jobs. Now, I think the reduction in population growth, fewer children per household, later births of children, and so on, means that the potential for parents to invest in their children is substantially increased. There should be complementary policies to go along with that, of course. But at the same time, it's equally important to ensure that from the demand side of the labor market, children perceive that if they decide to stay in school, if they're motivated to work harder in school, there will be some reward to them from doing that.
Thank you. Lydia, could you allow Professor Hal, I think he raised a hand, Professor Hal Hill from the Australian National University, to ask a question directly. Professor Hal?
Thanks, Kim Long, and Ian. G'day, how are you? Good to see you. Good to see you. And thanks for a really stimulating presentation, as always. You make us think, which is terrific. So I haven't fully absorbed all your ideas and your data. So let me just throw out a couple of quick comments or questions, but if I miss something, just ignore it. First of all, I kind of do worry that you are being too gloomy, as you said in one of your later slides. What's the evidence of this? Well, I know you're presenting evidence of what you think is this low-skilled trap. It just intuitively, anecdotally, I'm not really convinced. So we know that in these internationally oriented sectors, a lot of upgrading goes on, and it's partly just for the reasons you allude to, the sort of standard, almost comparative advantage story, increasing demand for labour, rising real wages. So you think of things like within the garments industry, we know there's a lot of change as countries move from low wages to higher wages. They keep garments, but they transition to different subsets of it,
Sure.
From the very basic to the higher quality stuff and all that stuff. We know in in the global production sharing stuff, Chandra's work that, again, countries shift quite a lot within it from the basic assembly stuff to the high value added stuff. We know also in services, actually, and a good example is the Philippines, the BPOs, where we see a lot of evidence that as they've developed, they have moved to quite sophisticated service activities within the sector. So I'm sort of worried a bit about this low-skilled trap argument.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the first thing. And can I just quickly mention a couple of other things? Your returns to schooling data, I haven't quite worked it out. I mean, you've got a decrease in returns to schooling. Isn't that partly because in earlier generation there were so few high school and even less university graduates that they attracted a scarcity premium when you suddenly get rapid economic growth? I mean, I think that's a story for Indonesia, certainly, and I suspect other countries. And so you've got this falling returns to schooling as you get mass education coming onto that labour market as well. So the scarcity premium falls. Sort of related point, and I'll stop very soon, I promise. The skill intensities, the tradables and the non-tradables. Is that really such a pronounced story? Sure, I know if the non-tradables are sort of the informal trading, the sidewalk vendors, it is. But a lot of the trades work is actually quite skilled, isn't it? Construction has a lot of skill in it as well as some unskilled work. And of course, a lot of other services do. Final related, just data point, simple question, I guess, is the quantity of education indicators, years of schooling and, Barrow Lee and all that stuff. It always worries me a bit, although we all use it, of course, but a year of schooling for a kid from a rich family and a year of schooling for a kid from a poor family is really totally different, isn't it? So the rich go to high quality schools, the poor kids go to low quality public schools. In the internet era, of course, in the COVID era, it's become even much more accentuated because the low quality schools don't have internet. But general point, this years of schooling thing, I kind of think it'd be nice to fine tune it, but I can't quite think how at the moment. But just a few rambling thoughts, Ian, and congratulations. Terrific and stimulating work. Good on you.
Well, when Hal Hill congratulates you for stimulating work, that you've got a problem. So I'm going to,
You haven't got a problem, I assure you.
Let me work backwards through your points there, Hal. Average years of education. Yeah, those data are looking over the entire labour force, so they're averages in a very real sense. And for that reason, they are a little bit less useful. They're good because they're internationally comparable. But what you really want to know is what's happening at the margin. And so what's happening with the youngest cohorts of school leavers? In the slides, I transitioned from average years of schooling to some of those marginal data. And what they show there is that, for example, kids in Indonesia, if you take a sample of 20 to 25-year-olds, then you find that they're averaging about 10 years of education now. So the younger generations are getting more education than older generations. And that's, of course, I think, an important part of what you're looking for. The other side to that story, however, is that increasing average years of education in the population is also influenced by the retirement out of the labour force of older generations for whom educational attainment is far, far lower. And I think that this is particularly salient in the Vietnamese data, where the generation now undergoing retirement grew up during the war years and the immediate post-war years under conditions that were really not favourable for persistent in education. So as they retire, the average years of education in the population goes up, even if nothing else changes. And I think your point is well taken. We should be looking at the marginal rather than the average years of education. That's one thing. Going backwards, skills in services. You cited the Philippines. I quite agree on the Philippines, but the average skill intensity of non-traded industries in the rest of lower income Southeast Asia, I'm thinking about Vietnam, Indonesia, and related countries, the skilled to unskilled labor ratio there is still very, very low. Sure, there are skills required for construction, but they're not typically the kinds of skills that you're going to learn by staying in school, at least not beyond basic literacy. Supply growth. I've struggled with this a lot. So we see declining returns to education, and it's pretty common in the literature, and it's certainly been true in the Indonesian literature, to speculate that this decline in returns to education is a function of the outward shift of skilled workers, the supply of skilled workers. So as we have more and more children graduating from school, then of course skilled labor becomes more abundant, and other things equal, its price will go down. But if you do a little back of the envelope calculation on that, it doesn't stand up very well, because think about an economy which is growing at, let's say, 5% per year. If nothing was changing in terms of the structure of production and employment, then the demand for skills would also be rising at 5% per year, and as would the demand for low-skilled workers, and the skill premium wouldn't be changing. So that if the skill premium is going to fall, then we've got to be adding skilled workers, for this reason at least, then we've got to be adding skilled workers to the labor force at a much higher rate than 5% per year. And I don't believe that that's the case anywhere in Southeast Asia, at least not at the moment. Finally, I knew that when I used the word trap, I'd get in trouble. So I withdraw the word trap, and hope you don't think that I'm still too gloomy. How's that?
Good on you. Thanks, Ian. Well done.
Thank you. Can we move to the next question?
Which one is next one?
Yeah, I think can we give Ariel or Adrianto to the opportunity to ask question, Lydia?
Arif, you are unmuted.
Hello.
Yes, Arif. Arif, please. Yes.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Professor Coxhead. A very interesting presentation and very insightful one. I was just wondering about the possible relationship between FDI, income, and poverty. Are they really independent? Because if not, then how would you think FDI affect income and or poverty in the areas where the investment is done? After addressing this indigeneity issues, would the net effects of FDI on education still be negative? I'd really like to hear your views on this, because at the end of the day, as interesting your conclusion is to me, but I just want to avoid policymakers to jump into the wrong conclusion and go into policies that might actually prevent foreign investments to come into the country.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, your motivation is excellent, and I would want to avoid the same thing myself. So in the data that I presented, we used FDI intensity of employment, that is the share of workers in FDI enterprises, as a proxy for labor market activation. And as I mentioned earlier in the talk, for every job that gets created in a factory, there are somewhere between, I don't know exactly because we're still working on this, but somewhere between 3 and 5 other jobs getting created in ancillary industries, if you like, industries around the edge of the industrial park. Is FDI endogenous in a particular locality? I think that case is difficult to make. My co-authors and I have worried about this quite a lot for obvious reasons. But I think that it would be pretty unusual, at least in Southeast Asia, to see foreign investors choosing the location in which to build their plant based on the characteristics of the labor force in that area. Everyone knows that labor is mobile. They're much more likely to be choosing on other criteria, for example, access to a port or infrastructure or other things like that, than to be going out and looking for a particular set of characteristics in the labor market. So I'm not so worried about endogeneity. As far as the links between FDI, income, and poverty are concerned, I think this is a very robust area, and we know this from very basic economics, that FDI is a way of introducing new investment goods into the economy, capital, and that capital comes bundled with other assets like technology and global networks and other things like that. And so ipso facto makes labor more productive. That is, whatever the mix of skills and low-skilled labor employed in a particular FDI-owned installation, that labor is going to be more productive by virtue of having more capital to work with. And often, indeed, the kinds of capital and the kinds of enterprise matter a great deal as well. So very clearly, very strong, robust, positive causal chain from FDI to higher incomes and lower poverty.
Can I just clarify one thing, Professor Coxhead? So I'm sorry if it didn't get through very well. It's just that your regression results, basically, from your regression results, you argue that income and poverty has an increase in income and a reduction in poverty has positive effect on education, right?
Yeah.
And if FDI is going to increase or decrease income and decrease poverty, then would the net effect on education from FDI still be negative?
So the point that I was making there was that by increasing by activating a labor market, I guess, FDI, which is really a proxy for overall labor market activity rather than FDI specifically, is creating or contributing to forces which might run counter to those created by higher incomes or lower poverty. So if income goes up, of course, parents want to keep their children in school longer. If they have the means to do so, if they can access credit, if they are escaping poverty, then of course they want to do so. The problem that arises for me is that if the cause of that income growth is a more active labor market, and that parents are gaining income from that, then the other side of that labor market may be that their children are also being pulled into employment at an earlier age. So that's the tension referred to in the title. It's not that one will necessarily cancel the other out, but rather that they are operating in different directions.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Professor Ian. Can we move to the next question? I think maybe we give Peter. Peter, would you like to ask a question directly?
Good. Hi. You can hear me? Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I can hear you. Hi, Peter.
Hey, hi, Ian. Hi, Ian. Good to see you. I'm from Canberra. Hal's from Canberra. So we're talking to you a long way away. Listening. Thank you for the presentation and listening to it. There's one, I guess the phrase is elephant in the room. I mean, there's one big issue that sort of just sits there for me when we talk about these things, and that's that when one looks at almost any reasonable measure of human capital. This is a question really about human capital in different countries. And levels of human capital in quite a few of the developing countries, including in Indonesia, are still very low. And the gap between developing countries and rich countries on most measures is very high. So, and I've got just a couple of points to make, and this is my first point. That gap just sits there. And so when I look at Indonesia or a whole range of other developing countries, it just seems obvious that one needs to try to pour enormous amounts of resources, and in fact, one does not have enormous amounts, but pour resources into primary, secondary, tertiary education. Now, of course, one can talk about the balance and so on. I mean, in recent years, Indonesia has caught up quite a bit in primary education, and there seems to be more of a need in secondary education, possibly in tertiary. One can talk about, as it were, the ideal changes at the margin, but the bottom line is that the countries are still very short of human capital. So this is sort of my first, and it sort of sits there as I listen to you talking about, as it were, the fine tuning. This, in a sense, seems to perhaps not be paying enough attention to this basic point of lots more education is still needed. Now, related to that is that you've looked quite a bit at the demand side, which is good, very useful. Thank you very much. But when I look at, say, Indonesia, a lot of the problems seem to be on the supply side, in the sense of the government providing, the public sector providing resource, or government policy providing resources. We've got a big problem. The government has very few resources. Government expenditure as a proportion of GDP is around about 10 or 12%. Long, very low. For all intents and purposes, the government has very little money. So in the education sector, we're facing these sort of two dilemmas. On one hand, levels of human capital are still very low and great effort is needed. On the other hand, the resources available are terribly slim. Now, I'm sorry, this is in a sense not relevant to what you have been talking about, but I would just like to tease you, since I've sort of bowled up these elephants in the room, how do they relate to what you've said? That's sort of my question. Over to you. Thanks, Ian. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So hard to disagree on anything you said, that the stock of human capital in Indonesia, or indeed Cambodia or Vietnam or even Thailand, is dramatically lower than in any wealthy country. Of course, there's a literature which looks at that and then asks, well, why is it that if that stock is so low, why isn't it that returns to education are much, much higher in those countries than they actually are? And I think that sort of motivates the kind of study that I do, because if you look at returns to education, you don't see evidence of returns that are offered moving to close that educational gap.
Sorry, may I just cut in there? But levels of other forms of capital, I mean, if we look at education as human capital, physical capital is also very low. So you'd have to look at returns, I would have thought, to human capital relative to levels of other forms of capital, particularly, say, produced capital, physical capital, that sort of thing. How does that...
Well, yeah, but I think there's very strong complementarity, you would agree, between physical capital and skills. And so if a country is scarce in physical capital, then the demand for skills is also relatively low.
Right. So I'm saying it's not really all that surprising that the returns are low. I mean, if both human capital and physical capital are low, there's a development problem, rather than sort of looking at the returns to human capital. If maybe I'm not clear, sorry.
Okay, I understand what you're saying now. Turning to your point about supply side, there's absolutely no disagreement there that there is a shortage of investment, not only from the public sector, but also, we've got to say it, by individuals, families in education in Indonesia. And, I don't know whether Daniel Suryadharma is still on the call or not, but he's someone that can speak with much greater expertise to this in Indonesia than I ever could. He's been very much involved with the RISE program, which is a global program with a presence in Indonesia as well as in Vietnam, which tries to identify constraints to successful improvements in the school system and then address those constraints. And the RISE program, I think, is a really good example of complementary resources coming from outside to, in a sense, top up or compensate for underspending from national and domestic sources. There's no end to the amount of spending that could take place there. My problem is only that if there isn't a commensurate increase in demand for skills, then some of that spending is wasted, or at least will not achieve the goals that it's intended for. It's a little like pushing on a string. If there aren't the jobs for skilled workers, then it's going to be really hard to convince the school system, and in particular children in that school system, to stick with it all the way through to 12th grade and maybe beyond, given the opportunity cost that the labour market presents them.
I think, thank you, Professor Ian. And can we move to the next question? Charles, would you like to ask a question directly? Over to you, Charles.
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm
Please.
Charles Horioka from Kobe University in Japan. Ian, it's good to see you and good to hear your talk.
How nice for you to join us.
Yes. Well, it's my pleasure, and Yoko is also with us. But thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I think your points are well taken. But I have to admit that I share Hal Hill's assessment that perhaps you're being a little bit overly pessimistic about the situation. And in fact, I have one possible solution to this low skill trap. I realize you've already retracted that term, but just to,
Yes.
I like the term actually, so let me use it. You showed in one of your graphs, I'm sorry, I don't remember what country it was referring to, but you showed that most of the high skilled jobs are concentrated in the government sector or the state-owned enterprise sector. Yeah. And furthermore, that you need personal connections to get these jobs. And therefore, for the everyday person, there's no point in their, continuing getting more schooling, because they wouldn't be able to get those jobs anyway if they don't have the personal connections. So the obvious solution to the problem is to get rid of the influence of personal connections, avoid jobs in the government sector and the state-owned enterprise sector solely on the basis of merit. Have like an exam like in Japan or in China where, people with the highest scores get those jobs. And then there'll be more of an incentive for people to get more schooling because they at least have a chance of getting these high-skilled jobs. Now, I realize this is easy to say, but hard to implement because governance, it's a governance issue, and their vested interests, well-connected people will not agree to reduce the influence of personal connections. But I'm wondering if this is a possible solution to the problem. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. That's a really interesting question. And it turns out that's one that I've spent quite a bit of time in the past thinking about. So I have a couple of papers from, now about 7 years ago. The most recent one came out last year, in which we look at differences between state and non-state employment in Vietnam. The data that you're referring to came from Vietnam, which of course is, a little bit of a special case when it comes to the presence of government and state-owned enterprises in the economy as well. Quantitatively, we are able in those studies to see that one of the most strong and robust predictors of continuing education in Vietnamese households, that is progression not only to high school, but also when it happens on to college. One of the strongest predictors of that is the presence in the household of a family member who is an employee of government or of a state-owned enterprise. And this is after controlling for differences in things like income and location and everything else. So it's a pretty specific kind of a finding. And that's what leads me to the conclusion that, that and lots of anecdotal evidence that there is non-market rationing of those jobs. And basically, if you don't belong to a family that has that kind of connection, then the probability that you can, having taken the exam, which does exist, actually get a job offer is pretty low. So that's a problem, as you say, of governance and indeed of corruption as well. But I want to spin this another way, Charles, a way that I think is maybe more amenable to policy solutions. The other feature of the state-owned sectors in Vietnam is that they have tremendously favorable treatment in the financial markets. So they have access to capital at very low rates and with very easy terms, and they can technically not really go bankrupt and all of this kind of thing. And that plus the constitutional makeup of the state banking system in Vietnam means that lending to SOEs is a hugely preferable activity for a bank than lending to small and medium enterprises, especially those in the informal sector who lack collateral and all the rest. And the interest rates faced by private sector borrowers in general and by small and medium enterprises in particular in Vietnam are punitively high relative to those faced by the state-owned sector. And as a consequence of that, because it costs money to borrow, to invest, they invest a lot less. They invest a lot less in the kinds of equipment and technologies that might be complementary with skills. So when we look at the contrast in those data between the skills composition of the private sector labor force and that of the governments and SOEs, part of what we're seeing there is actually a second round consequence of a distortion, a very big distortion in the capital market, which basically crowds out many SMEs from accessing the kind of capital that would enable them to upskill and modernize their operations and therefore increase their relative demand for skilled workers. And I think that that's maybe something that the Vietnamese government in particular could work on more easily than reforming its entire system of governance.
Good point. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Can I invite Sarah to ask question? Sarah,
hi,
over
Ian.
to you. Yes.
Yes. Hi, Ian. Thank you so much for this really interesting talk. I left for about 5 minutes, so if someone has already asked this question, I'm sorry about that. I'm just wondering how much of the talk is more of a Vietnam story, in the sense that they had a huge export sector growth, and at the same time, there's less investment in education. I think for some other countries, including Indonesia, a lot of people are arguing that it has missed the global value chain opportunity, and we can also see export hasn't really been growing in the last basically 20 years. So would that kind of make the story different? Like how would your kind of general narrative apply to countries like Indonesia?
Okay, great question. Thank you, Sarah. Obviously, Indonesia is very special in that it has abundant natural resource wealth, and the exports of natural resources have had a very big influence on the structure of production and indeed employment in Indonesia as well. But to return to your original, the first part of your question, is this just a Vietnam story? I think pretty conclusively the answer to that is no. When we look at Vietnam, we see an economy which has undergone very rapid transformation, and so it's kind of exemplary for the characteristics that I was studying. But our Cambodian friends would also be looking at Vietnam, I think, and saying, wow, Vietnam by comparison is a far more diversified and far more an economy in which skills are even more highly rewarded than in Cambodia, which, of course, as you know, is extremely, almost pathologically specialized in assembly-type operations in garment, textiles, and footwear. So I think that there's a lesson here for the Cambodian economy, for sure. But I want to be a little bit more adventurous than that and say that there's actually quite a lot of comparisons that are valid also with the Thai economy. And one of my graduate advisors is perhaps still online. He's working on this in the case of Thailand, and he's coming up with some pretty interesting stuff there. He's looking across provinces and municipalities in Thailand by differences in the population on skills, or the labor force on skills, and asking about the effects on education of changes in trade. So he's asking basically, if exports go up, then what happens in this kind of two-way track of incomes and the skill premium to overall education? And he's starting to come up with some, he would want me to say, still preliminary results, but I think very interesting results that show exactly the same kind of tensions operating in Thailand as I've documented for Vietnam. And hopefully that work will become ready for public consumption very soon, and I think you'll find it very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Professor Ian Coxhead. I think we now come to the close of the session, and I apologize for the questions remain unanswered. I think there are a couple more questions, and indeed this session is a very interesting session. And once again, many thanks to Professor Ian Coxhead for spending your time and also the passion to share your insight and experience. I think before turning over to Lydia, I would like to thank once again the Australian National University, especially Professor Budi Reso Sudarmo and Lydia from the forum Carl Jen, I think yeah. Pembangunan for hosting and organizing the event. Lydia, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Kim Long. Thank you, Ian, for your presentation. So, as I mentioned earlier, in the before the seminar, we will have an informal networking session. We have started to turn some of you into panelists. So the idea is that this is just okay. Let me stop recording.
Recording stopped.
This is not recorded. It's informal, and it's a chance for us to touch base, catch up with each other, and perhaps network people who are working in similar areas in terms of research or teaching, make connections, especially colleagues from Indonesia and